I'm Rogue from Fitness Gone Rogue, and today we're going to discuss posture analysis. We're going to take a little look at how our everyday life can affect our posture and how our roller derby can increase those highlighted areas of problems and how we can combat that, so how we can correct it. So first of all, what we're going to look at is something that many of us do every day, and many of us do pretty much all day, and that is sitting in a chair. So most of us have desk jobs or any kind of work where we are sat down for a long period of time. On top of that, when we get home, all we want to do is sit down. In fact, on top of that, the way we get home generally involves us sitting down. So we do lots and lots of sitting down. So let's have a look at the act of sitting, just in case you were unclear of what that was. So sitting down, what happens in the body when we sit? We have flexion at the hip joint and we have flexion at the knee joint. Flexion is simply a decreased angle at the joint. So if I was to stand up, if I want to decrease the angle at this joint, bring that knee up. As you can see, it's a decreased angle. And the same thing is occurred at the knee as well. Decreased angle. So that's flexion. How does that occur in our body? What muscle groups cause that action to happen? At the hip joint, it's the hip flexor. The hip flexor runs across the hip joint here, and it kind of pulls that leg up. And at the knee joint, it's our hamstring. Hamstring runs down the back of the thigh, and it pulls the leg up. So there is a contraction in these two muscles to cause this flexion at both these joints. What that in turn means is there's a shortening of these muscles. I try to get away from shortening because it kind of confuses it, but I'm going to use it in this case because I think it does help to describe the situation that's occurring. So when we're sitting down all day, we have a shortening at the hip flexor and a shortening of the hamstring, and that becomes kind of our body's natural habitual state. We spend most of our day in that, and so our body gets very good at that. What in turn happens when we get very good at one action is we become not so good at the opposite action. The opposite action to flexion is extension. So me standing here now I'm in extension. Okay, so there's extension at the hip joint, extension at the knee joint when I stand. If I've got very good at sitting, very good at flexion, my body's not very good at extension. What does that mean? Well, what it tends to mean is our body kind of skips processes, and in extension, it tends to skip it and go to hyperextension. So that's when a joint is beyond the slight extended position and it's gone into a hyperextension. So let's take a look at why these two muscle groups can cause this to happen in our body. So for our habitual way of standing now, due to our shortened hip flexors and hamstrings, we have what's called an anterior tilt occur at the pelvis. So what that means is it's tilted anteriorly, it's tilted forward. Okay, so if I kind of use my hand so you can see that kind of action, I'm going to try and demonstrate it now for you. So because we've got hyperextension happening at the hip joint, we end up with an anterior tilt and a shift in the pelvis. Okay, so that's anteriorly tilted. The hip flexor is tight, it's pulling it down, and the hamstring is tight, and it's pulling it up. And so we get this anterior tilt happening in the pelvis. So you can kind of see how that's changing my posture. I come up to straight, and bring my arm that way, and then I anteriorly tilt. You can see there's that curvature occurring in the lower back. What's also happening now is because I'm coming into that hyperextension, because I've got that anterior tilt, it's changing other areas of my posture. It's having to, in order to keep my body center line in the right line. So anteriorly tilted and shifted forward to the pelvis to come into this hyperextension. So I've ended up with this lower back curvature happening here. You can see that there. Because if I was to anteriorly tilt and then kind of keep my back straight, you can see that I'm kind of on a diagonal now, and my centre of gravity is all messed up. So what I actually do in turn is I bring my chest up, back in line with my hips, to kind of counter that. So I end up with the curvature in the lower spine. There's something happening lower in the leg as well. So because of this anterior tilt and shift, my weight has come forwards over my feet, and so the weight that I'm carrying now in my feet is in the balls of my feet. That in turn is going to cause a shortening in another muscle group, and that is the gastrocnemius and the soleus here in the back of the calf muscle here, back of the leg. Because our weight's in our balls of our feet, they're going to cause a tightening there as well. So now we've got a tightening in the hamstring, tightening in the hip flexor, and a tightening in the calf muscle. And all that is from our body trying to cope with our natural habitual state. So, what does this all mean? You're all sort of probably wondering, well, is that good or bad? What? It's not great. We don't really want to be carrying tightness in any of our muscles. We want to be fully mobile. And we want our biomechanics, our body, to be able to not bypass any of our actions. So we don't want it to bypass extension because we need it. We need to be able to stand up. We need to be able to go through full range of motion, especially when it comes to our roller derby. So we don't really want to be constantly in this anterior tilt position. We certainly don't want our weight to constantly be in the balls of our feet, especially when we come to roller derby training. When we come to roller derby training, let's have a look at that. What do we get told when we first start skating? What we tend to get told is to get into derby stance. And my favourite thing about that is it's quite often described as sitting in a chair. So we've spent all day sitting in a chair, and then we go skating to do our activity, and we're going to highlight those same areas, and we're going to be told to get into derby stance and told to sit in a chair. If you look at derby stance, as I'm in now, what have we got? We've got flexion at the hip joint, and we've got flexion at the knee joint. So we're exaggerating those already shortened muscle groups. The other thing that often gets told at roller derby training for many skills is put your weight in your heels. If we have an anterior rotation at the pelvis, then we're going to have, as I said, our weight in the balls of our feet. So putting our weight into our heels is going to be very difficult for us. We've probably got a shortening in that calf muscle, so it's actually going to feel very awkward for us. So just by correcting our posture in our everyday lives and having a look at that can really help our skating as well. So let's take a look at that anterior shift and what can we do to kind of rectify these problems. So I showed you the anterior tilt, like so. So we're tilting the pelvis forwards. What we want to be able to do is to correct that and actually tilt the pelvis posteriorly, just back. And what actually happens when we do that is the weight distribution goes from being in the balls of our feet to being much more evenly distributed throughout the whole of my foot now. So instead of my weight being solely in the balls of my feet with my anterior tilt, I can feel it come back into the middle of my feet, and I can definitely feel it if I really want to, driving through my heels. The other thing that's great about being able to control our anterior tilt and come back into a posterior tilt is it actually engages our lower abdominal muscles. And so we're going to be able to activate that core strength that we need for roller derby. So as I posteriorly tilt, I can feel my lower abs engage, and I can feel much more strength in my core just by doing that very simple tilt. Now I can still get into my derby stance with my posterior tilt, still come down, and I feel like my weight is much more into the whole of my feet rather than the balls of my feet. I feel a lot stronger because I can engage my core now, and I'm feeling less pressure in my lower spine. That's the key thing about that posterior tilt, is we no longer have that curvature in the lower spine. And just from doing the demonstration, I'm starting to get a little bit of backache in my lower back. We really don't want to be in any kind of discomfort or pain. So that's the anterior and posterior tilt. There's the anterior and there's the posterior. And another key thing about this, being able to correct this, is looking after those muscle groups. So we now know that we're going to likely to have a tightening in the hip flexor and a tightening in the hamstring. So how can we combat that? Well, here's a couple of exercises that you can do to lengthen and to give a little bit back to your hip flexors and your hamstrings. Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 exercises that you can do to combat these areas of tightness of the hip flexor and the hamstring. The first exercise we're going to do is going to help you with the hip flexor. I've got a nice mat here if you want to grab a mat to do this, or you can also grab like a towel or a cushion for under the knee, because we're going to be in a lunge position on the knee. Some people find that a bit uncomfortable. So we're going to come into a lunge position. Once we've got ourselves into this split leg stance, we're going to make sure of 2 things. Firstly, our hips are square, and secondly, that we have that posterior tilt. We don't want that anterior tilt, because it's not really going to be stretching really getting deep into our hip flexor. So we're going to posteriorly tilt that pelvis, and if you have tight hip flexors like me, as soon as you posteriorly tilt, you're going to feel that stretch kick in. So we're going to make sure that we ease into this stretch. So once we've posteriorly tilted, we kind of hold it there and then ease it forwards, moving through the stretch on the exhale. And what you might find if you've got really tight hip flexors is that as soon as you start to move forwards, you end up anteriorly rotating again. So really being very strict with yourself about your technique and your positioning. And feeling that stretch across the front of the hip. Now you're going to hold that stretch for between 1 to 2 minutes. What we have a tendency to do with stretching is kind of hold it for about 30 seconds and give up because our attention span is gone, whatever. But we really want to get a good deep stretch to try and really rectify this problem. So you're going to hold that stretch for 1 to 2 minutes, and you're also going to make sure that once you've done the one side, we're going to come on to the other side as well to even it up. Posterior rotate, anterior, and you might find, more than likely, you'll have one side tighter than the other, and that has a large part to play in our roller derby because we always skate in the same direction. So for me, my right hip is not as tight as my left. That's to do with my muscular imbalance and the way that I skate. If that's the case, then you might want to spend a little bit more time on the tighter side, just to really make sure that you're evening that up. Okay, so that was exercise number 1 for our hip flexors. Exercise number 2 is for our hamstrings. Now for this, I'm going to use a chair, but you can also use the wall. Now, this stretch is particularly for those of us that have very tight hamstrings. The usual hamstring stretches, maybe a seated hamstring stretch or a downward dog pose from some yoga. If you have very tight hamstrings, you are going to really struggle to get into the correct position for those stretches. And more often than not, we end up not really stretching the hamstrings and just playing into our bad posture. So the one I'm going to show you now is going to really help you with A, figuring out where your anterior and posterior tilt is, and B, it's going to really help you to get a more comfortable stretch for those hamstrings. So I'm going to use a chair, but you could use a wall. What we're going to do is we're going to come into the downward dog position, feet under the shoulders, shoulder width apart, legs nice and straight, and we're going to place the hands on the back of the chair. If you have the wall, you can go to wherever you feel you can manage. Now, we're going to actually start to anteriorly rotate anteriorly tilt, I keep saying rotate, I mean tilt, the pelvis, because we want to really stretch that hamstring, so we need to come into a slight anterior tilt. However, we really need to now be aware of when we are too anteriorly rotated and when it's the right position. So what we're going to try and aim to get is a nice flat back. If you want to, you can actually use a broom handle and put the broom handle along your back. I haven't actually got a broom handle, so I'm not going to do that. But we're going to come down, hands on the chair, straighten those legs, try not to lock the knees back, try and keep the knees a little bit soft. And we're going to find there's the posterior, into an anterior, and really try and get a nice straight back. once we've found that position, we can start to really shift the butt back further, and then you'll start to feel that hamstring stretch, getting nice and deep into the hamstrings. And really try and keep the back nice and straight. Now if you've held this for a little while, you feel quite warm, you can start to move those hands down the wall or down the chair. What we need to be aware of though is that we don't come into that deep anterior tilt. And we don't come into that posterior tilt. We need to make sure that the back is nice and flat and long. And again, you're going to hold that stretch for 1 to 2 minutes. If you need to come out of it and come back into it, then you can. But really this is about being more aware of our posterior and anterior tilt in the pelvis, and being aware of when we get a flat back and when we don't. And that will feed into many of your on-skates and off-skates exercises. Perfect for planks. If you want to get a nice flat plank, then you need to be aware of how to anteriorly and posteriorly tilt the pelvis. And it would be really great for core work in your skating stance. Hi, I'm Rogue from Fitness Gone Rogue. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you found it informative, or if you'd like to hear more about these kinds of topics, then we'd love to hear from you. You can drop a comment in the comments box below. You can get in contact with us on Facebook, or you can email us at rogue@fitnessgonerogue.com. We love hearing from you, and we really want to make more of these videos, but we need to know what you want to hear about, so let us know. Thanks a lot.